Hello and welcome. We're at the Swift African Regional Conference in Accra, Ghana. I'm with Moono Mupotola, who's the Director of Regional Integration for the African Development Bank. Welcome. And you've obviously been talking about the opportunities from the Continental Free Trade Area, which has just come into being. Can you tell us a little bit about it and how it came into being?
It's all very exciting and new. So far we've had 52 countries who've signed up to the Continental Free Trade Area. 3 countries are yet to sign up, but so far 24 countries have ratified, and by that I mean they've domesticated, it's gone through the internal process, and they're ready to roll out.
Because there's obviously a difference between signing up and being ready to go with it.
Yeah, ready to go. So there are 24 countries that are ready to go, and we expect that in July in Niamey we'll actually have the official launch of the Continental Free Trade Area. And so far, a lot of progress has been made. We're looking at free movement of goods, free movements of services. I mean, the negotiations are ongoing, but we expect that by next year, these will be fully done.
Because it have the potential to be one of the biggest, if not the biggest, free trade area in the world.
But I think what is most important is the opportunities that it brings to African countries. So our own estimates as the African Development Bank is that if only tariffs, if countries were to reduce tariffs, the GDP of Africa would grow by 0.1%, but this translates into about $12 billion in GDP per year. Likewise, we've done a couple of scenarios. Scenario 4, which is really the best scenario, looks at $134 billion GDP growth for Africa. So this is really substantive, and if we implement this, we have potential to not just grow markets, but also create jobs. As you're aware, we have a lot of young people whom we need to create jobs for, and this agreement will help us do that.
But now with all these kinds of projects, there's a lot of other things that have to go along with it, aren't there? And obviously we're at a SWIFT conference, so I mean, do we have the payments infrastructure to make this work?
The payments infrastructure is what we really need to work on. What we've seen is that at sub-regional level, there are some payment systems that allow payments to be done in local currency. So we look at Southern Africa, for example, where the payment system is actually done in the South African rand. And this actually brings down transaction costs.
Rather than doing everything in dollars.
Yeah, rather than doing everything in dollars, also in the several monetary, the CFA zone, etc. But I think what we also need is to see how do we then develop the right infrastructure so that we actually, the reliance on using foreign payment settlements in foreign currency actually lessened. And I think that's what's important in bringing down transaction costs, but also ultimately making our producers and our exporters more competitive.
And how fast do you think that things are moving in that direction?
At sub-regional level, things are moving pretty fast, but it's also at the regional, at the Africa continent-wide level, where we have to move very, very quickly. However, I'm pleased to say that the Afro-Exim Bank, as part of its support to the Continental Free Trade Area, is developing an Africa-wide payment system. And I think this should be able to help us and also facilitate the payments in local currency and mostly to support intra-trade so that settlements are done in local currency.
Okay, now let's turn to capital markets because for all the companies to expand and take advantage of this trade area, they need to raise capital. Yes. So do we have in Africa the kind of integrated capital markets that we need to achieve that?
No, we don't. And I think this is one area where we need to grow, really have an integrated capital market system. We do have the Association of Stock markets, where several countries have come together and
to create a regional exchange, yeah.
What we need to do now, as we look at Africa's large infrastructure deficit, which is at $130 billion per year, is that realizing that African governments alone cannot pay for this. We'll now need to bring in private sector. So how do we do it? We need to securitize some of these assets, the infrastructure that are commercially viable, and we can only do it once we have mature capital markets.
All right, and what sort of initiatives are we seeing in that direction?
In that direction, as I said, also at sub-regional level, we're looking at trying to help our member countries, African countries that are members of the African Development Bank, in developing financial instruments. So, for example, we have several risk guarantee instruments that we are supporting our governments to try and crowd in the private sector. There's also the Africa Risk Capacity, which tries to also support African countries in managing risks, particularly against, political, etc. So I think it's very, very important that we develop these instruments, because we also need private sector to help us build that infrastructure.
Thank you very much, Moono, for updating us on the Continental Free Trade Area.
Thank you for having me.